The room went dead silent. 30 armed men. One exit. A Mafia boss bleeding on his knees with a gun pressed to the base of his skull. Everyone in that restaurant believed they knew exactly how this night would end. The bodyguards were zip-tied to radiators. The chef had fainted behind his own stove. The sommelier was crouched inside a wine cellar, texting his priest. But nobody, not the assassins, not the rival crime families watching from shadows across the street. Not even the boss himself had accounted for one single thing. The waitress? And what she did in the next 4 seconds would permanently rearrange the architecture of organized crime in America. The restaurant was called Benedetto's. It sat on the corner of West Huron and North Halstead in Chicago's River North neighborhood, a geographical fact that locals had quietly debated for years. Since the building technically straddled both streets, and the owner, a retired Sicilian-American named Sal Benedetto, had never once moved to resolve the dispute. He said the ambiguity kept his taxes interesting and his enemies confused. Benedetto's was exactly the kind of restaurant that had no business surviving into the current era. No social media presence, no open-table reservations, no Prix Fix tasting menu with a 9-month waiting list and a beverage pairing that cost more than a semester of community college. Just red-checkered tablecloths, candles melted down into old Chianti bottles, and a kitchen that produced the finest osso buco in the continental United States, at least according to Derek Ashford. The Chicago Tribune food critic, who had given it 4 stars in 2019 and then returned every single Thursday night for the next 4 years without writing another word about it. Some experiences, Derek had told his editor once, are better protected by silence. The staff was small. A head chef named Roberto, who had trained in Naples and communicated almost exclusively in gestures and disappointed sighs. A bartender named Frank DeLuca, who was 62 years old, wore the same vest every night, and mixed a Negroni that had reportedly made a federal judge weep. And the waitstaff 3 people on busy nights, 2 on slow ones. On the night, everything changed. It was a slow one. Karina Maddox was 28 years old and had been working at Benedetto's for 11 months. She had come to Chicago from a small town called Harlan, Kentucky, a place she described to anyone who asked as beautiful and suffocating in equal measure with a duffel bag, a teaching degree she had never used, and the specific kind of quiet determination that people from hard places carry like a second skeleton. She was not conventionally striking in the way that stops traffic. She was the other kind of beautiful, the kind that assembles itself slowly in your perception, detail by detail, until one afternoon you realize you have been looking at her for 10 minutes straight and cannot explain exactly when it happened. She had dark auburn hair she kept tied back during service, steady brown eyes that missed almost nothing, a way of moving through a crowded dining room, weaving between tables, balancing plates, never spilling, never rushing, that Sal Benedetto had once described to his wife as like watching someone who has already memorized the ending. He meant it as a compliment. His wife told him he was being strange. Karina had taken the job for simple reasons. It paid well enough. It was nights, which left her days free for the graduate criminology courses she was quietly completing at DePaul University, a fact she shared with almost nobody. Because in her experience, the moment you told people you were studying crime, they either became suspicious of you or started confessing things. She had no idea, on the last Tuesday of October, that both of those problems were about to become spectacularly irrelevant. Dalen Morris had been eating at Benedetto's every Tuesday night for 6 years. He always requested the same table the corner booth in the back left. The one partially hidden behind a decorative column, the one where a person could see every entrance and exit in the room without appearing to look at any of them. He always ordered the same meal, the ossobuco, a half bottle of Barolo, and a single espresso at the end. No dessert, no exceptions. He tipped 40% without variation, which Roberto had once confirmed made him a better tipper than God, or at least better than the bishop who came in on Sundays. To anyone who didn't know better, to the tourist couples and the young professionals and the occasional food blogger who wandered in, hoping for content. Dalen Morris looked like a prosperous businessman in his early 40s. Dark suit, no tie, silver beginning to work its way through his black hair at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something that started out harder than bone. He was the kind of man who occupied space without appearing to demand it, which was in fact the most dangerous kind of man there was. To anyone who did know better, to every law enforcement agency operating in Cook County, to the Department of Justice's Organized Crime Task Force, to Interpol, which had a file on him that ran to 312 pages and contained at least 40 words that had never been used in combination before Dalen Morris was the head of the Morris crime family, which had controlled Chicago's North Side for 22 years, and whose business interests ranged from legitimate real estate and restaurant supply companies to less legitimate activities that the DOJ file described. With bureaucratic restraint, as diversified, he was not, by the definitions his enemies preferred to use, a good man. He was, by the definitions that complicate those judgments, considerably more than a simple one. Karina had known who he was from her third week at Benedetto's, when she had looked him up out of pure curiosity after Sal had pulled her aside before service, and said, quietly, "The gentleman in the back corner is a very important regular. Attentive service. No questions. No familiarity unless he initiates." She had Googled the name off the reservation, one of only 3 Tuesday nights per year, when he actually made one and found enough to understand the subtext. She had made a decision that night that she held to for nearly a year. She would treat Dalen Morris exactly as she treated every other customer. No deference, no fear, no particular warmth. Professional, efficient, invisible. It lasted until the 3rd Tuesday of September. He had been sitting in his corner booth, halfway through his Barolo, when the elderly woman at table 7, a regular named Marge Kowalski, who came in every few weeks with her daughter and always ordered the gnocchi, had knocked her water glass off the table. The glass didn't break, but the water spread quickly, and Marge, who was 73 and moved with the careful dignity of someone in mild but constant pain, began trying to mop it up with her cloth napkin in a way that was making things worse. Karina was across the room. She crossed it fast, placed a gentle hand on Marge's arm, redirected her attention to her daughter with a quiet joke about the tablecloth being due for a swim anyway, swept up the mess in under 40 seconds, and replaced the water glass with fresh ice without once making the woman feel embarrassed. It was the kind of small grace that most people in the restaurant barely noticed. Dalen Morris noticed. When Karina passed his table on her way back to the service station, he said, without looking up from his wine, "That was well done." Karina paused. In 11 months of working at Benedetto's, she had never heard him say anything that wasn't an order or a one-word response to a question about the menu. "She's here every few weeks," Karina said. "She deserves to enjoy her dinner." He looked up then, and for a moment, just a fragment of a moment, The kind that you later struggle to convince yourself actually happened. Something behind his expression shifted. "Yes," he said. "She does." Karina nodded once, professionally, and moved on. But over the next 4 Tuesdays, a conversation built itself, sentence by sentence, the way rivers build themselves not by intention, but by the accumulated weight of small movements. He asked about the wine she'd recommend with the veal. She asked if he'd ever tried the lamb, which Roberto made only on alternating weeks, and which was, in her opinion, actually better than the osso buco, though she said that at a volume that ensured Roberto could not hear. Dalen had almost smiled at that. Almost. She learned, across those weeks, that he spoke 3 languages, had read more literature than most professors she knew, and had very specific opinions about architectural preservation in urban neighborhoods that suggested he had thought carefully about things beyond the obvious scope of his profession. He learned that she was from Kentucky, that she had a mordant and precise sense of humor, and that she had the unusual quality rare in anyone, vanishingly rare in his world of listening to what he said rather than performing the act of listening while waiting to speak. He did not tell her what he did. She did not tell him she already knew. That arrangement, that careful, mutually understood fiction, was the closest thing either of them had, in that period of their lives, to something resembling peace. It ended on the last Tuesday of October. The evening had started normally enough. Benedetto's had 7 tables occupied by 8 o'clock. Dalen arrived at his usual time, 8:15, with 2 of his regular security detail, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis Webb, and a quieter, watchful one named Patrick Lynn, who always took the 2-top near the front door and ordered coffee they didn't drink while surveying the room. This was the routine. It had been the routine for 6 years. What was not routine was the black SUV that parked on North Halstead at 8:22 and did not move. Karina noticed it through the front window while she was rolling cutlery near the host stand. A single vehicle, engine off, no one getting out. In Chicago's River North, double parking was effectively a municipal sport, but you didn't turn your engine off unless you were staying. She filed it in the back of her mind and moved on. By 8:45, there were 3 more vehicles on the street. Different makes, different positions, same quality of stillness. At 9:03, Frank the bartender came through from the service corridor, looking the color of old newspaper. He found Karina in the kitchen, picking up an order, and pulled her by the elbow to the dry storage room with a grip that communicated the specific urgency of a man who had seen something he wished he hadn't. "Back alley," he whispered. 6 men, all armed. They've been there for 20 minutes. I saw one of them through the window when I went out for a smoke. He had a radio. Karina felt her training sharpen behind her eyes. Not panic. Assessment. "Did you call the police?" she said. Frank looked at her with the expression of a man who has worked in this restaurant for 14 years. "Call the police," he repeated, as if she had suggested something in an unfamiliar language. "How many total do you think are outside?" she said. "I don't know. A lot. At least 3 cars on Huron, and they've got someone on the roof of the parking structure across the street. I could see the scope reflection. A sniper. Multiple approach vectors. Radio coordination. This was not opportunistic. This was an operation that had been planned with care and executed with precision by people who knew that Dalen Morris ate at Benedetto's every Tuesday and who had chosen tonight specifically. Which meant someone had told them. Karina set the ossobuco she was carrying back on the pass-through and looked at Frank with the total calm of someone who had spent the last 3 years studying the operational mechanics of exactly this type of scenario. "Get everyone into the kitchen," she said. "Roberto, the busboy, the dishwasher. Tell them quietly. Do not make a scene in the dining room. Can you do that? What are you going to do?" "I need to speak to Mr. Morris." Frank stared at her. "Karina." "Frank." She put her hand briefly on his arm, the same instinct that had guided her to Marge Kowalski's table 6 weeks ago. "I need you to trust me right now. I know what I'm doing." He didn't entirely believe her, but he did what she asked. Karina walked out of the kitchen, through the dining room, past the other tables, 2 couples, a group of 4 business travelers, and Marge Kowalski's daughter, who had come in alone tonight and to the corner booth. Dalen looked up from his wine. Something in her face made him put the glass down. "Don't react," she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him with the practiced casualness of someone delivering the dessert specials. "Smile if you feel you need to. But listen to me very carefully." He did not smile. He held her gaze with an absolute steadiness that she had come to understand was not composure, it was the face behind composure, the architecture that supported it. "Talk," he said. "There are at minimum 20 to 30 men surrounding this building, armed, coordinated. There is at least 1 elevated position across the street with an optical sight. They've been staging for the last 30 minutes. This is not a robbery." Dalen said nothing for a full 3 seconds. "You know what I am," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "How long?" 11 months. Another silence. Somewhere in the dining room, a fork scraped a plate. "My men at the front," he said. "I haven't looked directly at them, but if this operation is as thorough as it appears, they'll have been identified already." As if in confirmation of this assessment, the front door of Benedetto's opened. They came in fast and quiet, the way professionals do, not crashing through or announcing themselves with theatrics, but simply filling the space. The way water fills a vessel, inevitable and total. 7 men through the front, and through the kitchen, she would learn later, another 8. Curtis Webb was on his feet for exactly 2 seconds before one of the newcomers did something efficient and brutal with a collapsible baton that put him on the floor. Patrick Lynn was zip-tied to the radiator pipe near the host stand before he'd fully cleared his holster. The other diners were frozen in their seats, a tableau of arrested normalcy, a woman with a fork halfway to her mouth, a man who had been reaching for his phone and now held very still with his hand in the air, and standing at the head of the pack, wearing a charcoal overcoat and the expression of a man who has arrived exactly on schedule to collect something owed, was Raymond Tesaro. Raymond Tesaro was 51 years old and had been running the Southside Tesaro organization since his father, Gerald Tesaro, had died of a heart attack in federal custody in 2011, an event that Raymond had reportedly learned of while eating dinner at his own restaurant in Bridgeport and had received without visibly altering his expression or his appetite. He was not physically imposing. He was medium height, medium build. With thinning hair, he kept very short and pale blue eyes that people who had dealt with him professionally on both sides of the law consistently described in their statements and depositions as the eyes of someone who has already made the decision. He had been under federal investigation 4 separate times. He had never been charged with anything more serious than a 2008 tax irregularity that his lawyers had converted into a $40,000 fine and a firm handshake. The working theory among law enforcement was not that Raymond Tesaro was innocent. The working theory was that he was simply better at the math of exposure and deniability than anyone they had previously encountered. He walked to Dalen's booth and stood at the end of it, looking down at the two of them with an expression that contained something that in a different person might have been warmth. "Dalen," he said, "I am sorry about the disruption to your evening. I genuinely am." "Raymond," Dalen said, in a voice so level it seemed to have been poured from something. Tesaro's eyes moved to Karina. He studied her for a moment with the detached assessment of someone pricing an item at auction. "The waitress," he said. He looked back at Dalen. "She should move to the kitchen with the others." "I'm fine here," Karina said. Tesaro looked at her again. This time the assessment was slower, and its quality had changed. "You have a very steady voice for someone in your position," he said. "I've been told that." He almost smiled. Then he looked back at Dalen, and the almost smile was gone completely. "We need to talk about the Lake Shore arrangement," Tesaro said. Dalen said nothing. "You've been expanding north, into territory that we discussed 3 years ago, had a boundary." "Boundaries shift," Dalen said. "They do," Tesaro agreed pleasantly. "That's rather the point of tonight's conversation. I want to shift them back." He pulled out the chair across from the booth, a chair that had been, until 30 seconds ago, occupied by Karina, and sat in it with the ease of a man who believes all chairs are his chairs. "I have 31 men in and around this building. Dalen, your two are secured. The other diners and staff will leave unharmed once we conclude our business." He folded his hands on the table. "So I think it's time we talked about a new arrangement." Dalen held his gaze for a long moment. "You mentioned 31 men," he said. "You're very specific. I find specificity useful. It clarifies the practical reality of a situation." "It does," Dalen said. "That's a well-chosen word. Reality." Something changed in Tesaro's expression, the faintest tightening around his eyes, the micro-expression of a man recalibrating. "I want the North Shore contracts, all of them, and I want the Cicero distribution network transferred to my operation by the 1st of December. In exchange, you keep your South Loop holdings and your construction interests, and nobody has an unfortunate accident between now and Christmas." He let the silence sit, the way a skilled negotiator does, letting the weight of the offer press down on the other side of the table. Then he looked at Karina again. "Sweetheart," he said, not unkindly, but with the specific condescension of a man who has never once considered that a word like sweetheart could miss its mark. "Go to the kitchen." Karina looked at him. Then she did something that nobody in that room expected. She reached across the table, picked up Dalen's half-finished glass of Barolo, and took a small, deliberate sip. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Tesaro's pale eyes went very still. "Mr. Tesaro," Karina said, setting the glass down with perfect calm. "I think you should know a few things before you continue." What happened next would be described differently by every person who witnessed it. The couple at table 4, a pair of architects from Minneapolis named Todd and Rachel Bremer, who had found Benedetto's through a food newsletter, later told investigators that the waitress had just started talking, very quietly, and then everything sort of collapsed. The woman who had been holding the fork, a Chicago-based attorney named Diane Phelps, who had specifically chosen Benedetto's for a solo dinner because her divorce lawyer had recommended she avoid places her husband frequented, said it was like watching someone dismantle a clock. Patrick Lynn, zip-tied to the radiator, could only see the back of Karina's head. He later said he knew, in the moment she started speaking, that something had fundamentally shifted. He said the room felt different. He said the air pressure changed. What Karina said in the next 4 minutes was this. She told Raymond Tesaro that his entire operation tonight was already compromised. She told him that she was not, in fact, simply a waitress. That she was a third-year graduate student in the DePaul University Criminology and Justice Studies program, working under the supervision of Professor Alan Kretschmer, whose research focus was organized crime network architecture in Midwestern metropolitan areas, and that, for the last 7 months, as part of a practicum arrangement with the Chicago Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, she had been providing contextual research support to Special Agent Thomas Weller of the Organized Crime Unit, not in a capacity that required her to report on Benedetto specifically, but in a capacity that had put her in a position to hear things. What she had heard 6 days ago was this: a federal wiretap authorized under Title III of the Omnibus Crime Control Act, targeting a Tesaro-adjacent financial operation in Bridgeport, had inadvertently captured a conversation between 2 of Tesaro's lieutenants discussing the specific logistics of tonight's operation. The conversation had included the location, the date, the target, and the number of personnel involved. Which means, Karina said, in the same voice she used to describe the evening's wine specials, that every man you brought here tonight has been photographed entering this building by at least 2 different federal surveillance teams who have been positioned on this block for the last 4 hours. She reached into the front pocket of her apron. She put a small black device on the table. "That's a tactical radio," she said. "I took it off one of your men in the kitchen hallway 12 minutes ago when he came through the service corridor. Channel 7. If you'd like to verify what I'm telling you, you can ask your perimeter team why they've stopped responding." Tesaro stared at the radio. Then he looked at her with the totality of his attention, the full, unfiltered focus of those pale blue eyes, for what was probably 7 seconds, but felt considerably longer. "You're bluffing," he said. But his voice had lost something, a millimeter of its certainty. "I might be," Karina said. "The question you have to answer is whether you're willing to find out." Across the table, Dalen Morris had not moved, had not spoken, had barely appeared to breathe. His eyes had been on Karina from the moment she had picked up the wine glass. He was watching her the way you watch something you have catastrophically underestimated. Tesaro looked at the radio. He picked it up. He clicked to channel 7. Static. He clicked through channels. Static on 4 of them. The 5th produced a fragment of a voice, tense, quick, the specific register of someone reporting an unexpected development before cutting out. Tesaro set the radio down. He looked at Karina one more time, and in those pale eyes, in the space where the decision-making happened, something completed itself. He stood. He buttoned his coat. "This conversation is postponed," he said to Dalen. His voice was as level as it had been at the beginning, because Raymond Tesaro was the kind of man who would maintain his voice's level quality while standing in the rubble of everything he'd planned. He looked at Karina one last time. "You are either the most dangerous woman I have ever met," he said, "or the luckiest." Karina looked at him steadily. "Does it matter which one?" Tesaro said nothing to that. He walked toward the front door, and his men, all of them, the ones inside the restaurant, and from the sudden sound of vehicles starting on both streets, the ones outside began to withdraw with the practiced efficiency of an operation that has been called off rather than defeated. in 90 seconds. They were gone. The restaurant was utterly silent. Marge Kowalski's daughter let out a sound that was halfway between a sob and a laugh. Todd Bremer put both hands flat on his tablecloth, as if verifying it was still there. Frank the bartender emerged from the kitchen corridor looking like a man who has passed through a wall and cannot entirely explain what the wall was made of. Dalen Morris sat in his corner booth, his wine half-finished, the candle in its Chianti bottle guttering slightly from the disturbance of moving air. He looked at Karina. "The radio," he said quietly. "Did you actually take it off one of his men?" "Yes." "And the federal surveillance?" Karina held his gaze. "Mr. Morris," she said, "that is a conversation for another time." She did not go home that night. Not immediately. There were the diners to settle. Frank produced a round of cognac on the house for the remaining tables. And somehow the combination of alcohol and proximity to danger produced the specific bonding effect of people who have shared a foxhole. So that by 10:30, the Bremer architects were deep in conversation with Diane Phelps, the divorce attorney, about adaptive reuse projects in Lincoln Park. Marge Kowalski's daughter, whose name was Carol, stayed for another glass of wine and told Karina, with a sincerity that contained several layers of meaning, that her mother had always said this restaurant had unusual energy. Curtis Webb had a mild concussion and a split eyebrow that Roberta, who had, in a former life, apparently worked adjacent to professions that required familiarity with field medicine, cleaned and closed with butterfly strips from the first aid kit. Patrick Lynn had pulled his shoulder getting out of the zip tie, but was otherwise intact and profoundly, quietly furious about the zip tie specifically. Dalen's car arrived at 11:15. He had made 3 phone calls in the preceding hour, each one brief, each one in a register she could hear but not decipher. His men were already beginning to move outside, she assumed, in ways she could not, and perhaps should not know. He found her at the service station, refilling the salt and pepper on the last occupied table, out of the habit of someone for whom the ritual of closing down a restaurant was its own kind of meditation. "I would like to speak with you," he said. "I know," she said. They sat in his booth. Frank brought 2 espressos without being asked. Dalen looked at her across the table, the same table where, 2 hours ago, Raymond Tesaro had attempted to rearrange the map of Chicago's organized crime and said, "Tell me who you are." So she told him. Not everything, but enough. The degree she hadn't used, the graduate program, the research work. Professor Kretschmer, who was real and whose research was real, and whose practicum arrangement with federal agencies was real. Her 7 months of work with the Organized Crime Unit, which had been entirely research-based building network maps, analyzing financial flows, writing reports that went into binders that sat on federal desks, and influenced strategy that she never directly saw executed. She told him that 6 days ago. A research colleague had shown her, inadvertently, a summary document that referenced an operation targeting a location, described only as North Halstead Restaurant, and a Tuesday engagement window. She had understood immediately what it referred to. She had understood that she had, through a series of choices that had each seemed small at the time, placed herself at the intersection of 2 worlds that she had been studying from what she'd believed was a safe distance. "You could have reported it," he said, "to Weller, to your supervisor." "Yes. Why didn't you?" She looked at him. The candle between them had burned down to almost nothing, just a small, persistent light in the mouth of a wine bottle, guttering in its own wax. Because the surveillance team outside was there for Tesaro, she said. "Not for you. If I'd reported it through channels, the outcome of tonight would have been different. And there were other diners here. Sal's staff. Marge Kowalski's daughter." She paused. There were people who had nothing to do with any of this, who would have been in the middle of whatever happened. "That's not the only reason," Dalen said. "It wasn't. They both knew it." She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she said, "The radio wasn't bluffing. Channel 7 was dead because Tesaro's perimeter team had already been photographed and tagged and were being quietly detained by federal agents who were operating under an intercept warrant. Not a raid warrant. The legal distinction matters. They couldn't move on Tesaro inside the restaurant without triggering a jurisdictional issue that his lawyers would have turned into a dismissal. So they were holding outside." She looked at him. "I gambled that Tesaro didn't know enough about the specific legal architecture of the warrant to know that distinction. I gambled that the dead radio would be enough to convince him the noose was tighter than it was." "And if you'd been wrong," he said, "then this would be a different conversation." Dalen was quiet for a long moment. "You studied all of this," he said. "The networks, the operations." "Yes. My operation." She held his gaze. "There's a section in my second-year paper titled Morris Network, Structural Resilience and Succession Risk. Professor Kretschmer used it as a case study. He changed the names." Something moved in Dalen's eyes. It might, in another context, have been amusement. "Succession risk," he said. "You have no clear succession structure. It's a significant institutional vulnerability." "I appreciate the feedback," he said, and his voice carried for the first time since she had known him a quality that was unmistakably, quietly warm. They sat there for another hour, not talking about crime or law or Raymond Tesaro or the federal warrant, talking about other things, about a town in Kentucky where the mountains pressed in close and the summers were savage and beautiful, about a neighborhood in Chicago where he had grown up in a house that no longer existed, above a tailor shop that did, about books, about architecture, about the specific quality of silence in a good restaurant after the last customer has left that particular hush that means the work is done and the place can be itself again. At 12:40, Karina put on her coat. Dalen stood when she did. Old courtesy, instinctive. "You understand," he said, "that what happened here tonight changes things." "For you," she said, "Tesaro will regroup." "I don't mean Tesaro." She looked at him. "I mean that I have been coming to this restaurant for 6 years," he said, "and sitting in this booth, and I have thought of it as the one place in my life where nothing complicated happens, and now it is the most complicated place I have ever been." "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." He looked at her steadily. "I think I prefer it this way." She left. He watched her go, and then sat back down in the corner booth with the last cold dregs of his espresso and the guttered candle and the specific silence of a man who has just understood something about his own life that he cannot immediately put into words. The next 6 weeks were the most complicated of Karina Maddox's life, and she had grown up in Harlan, Kentucky, which had given her a baseline for complicated that most people never approached. The federal situation resolved itself partially, messily, in the way that legal and bureaucratic situations involving multiple agencies and competing jurisdictions almost always do. Special Agent Thomas Weller called her 3 days after the incident at Benedetto's. The call was professional and tightly controlled and contained. In its subtext, the specific quality of an institution deciding how to handle a situation that had gone sideways in ways that were technically beneficial but procedurally awkward. The short version was that Raymond Tesaro's operation had been significantly disrupted by the events of that Tuesday night. 4 of his lieutenants had been detained on the street outside Benedetto's and subsequently connected through the evidence gathered during the surveillance operation to a range of federal charges that Tesaro's lawyers were currently constructing what one DOJ source quoted anonymously in the Chicago Tribune by a journalist named Katie Ostrowski called a very expensive argument. The operation against Dalen Morris, which had been Tesaro's operation, not a federal one, had failed entirely. Weller told Karina that her continued participation in the research practicum was under review. He said it without visible hostility, but with the specific bureaucratic chill of an institution reassessing a relationship. She understood. She had made a unilateral decision in a moment where the correct procedural action would have been to contact him directly. The outcome had been arguably favorable. The process had been, from the FBI's perspective, chaotic and uncontrolled. She told him she understood. She meant it. Professor Alan Kretschmer was more direct. He called her into his office, which was crowded with books stacked in arrangements that defied both gravity and organizational logic, and looked at her across his desk for a long moment with the expression of a man assembling his thoughts in real time. "You wrote in your second-year paper," he said, "that effective intervention in organized crime structures requires systematic patience rather than reactive improvisation." "I know what I wrote," she said, and yet. She agreed. He studied her. Alan Kretschmer was 60 years old and had spent 35 of those years studying criminal organizations, and he had developed, over those decades, a capacity for assessing people that operated below the level of the words they were using. "You were protecting specific individuals," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I was protecting the people in that restaurant," she said carefully. He looked at her for another moment. "Karina," he said, "the most dangerous moment in any researcher's career is the moment the research becomes personal." She didn't answer that. There was no answer for it, or at least no answer she was prepared to offer in his office on a Thursday afternoon in November. She did not stop working at Benedetto's. Sal Benedetto had asked her, 2 days after the incident, if she wanted to stop. He had asked it gently, in the manner of a man who has lived long enough to understand that some questions need to be asked even when the asker already knows the answer. She had told him no. She had told him she would understand completely if he felt her continued presence created complications for the restaurant. He had looked at her with his dark, tired, perceptive eyes, and said, "You kept my restaurant from becoming a crime scene. The least I can do is keep your table clear." Dalen came back the following Tuesday. He sat in the corner booth. He ordered the osso buco and the Barolo. He looked up when Karina appeared with the wine. And there was a moment, brief, waited, acknowledged by both of them with the silence it deserved, before she set the glass down and said, "Roberto is doing the lamb tonight, too. If you want to try it." He looked at her. "I've been meaning to try it for a long time," he said. "Most things worth doing take longer than they should." She said, "Yes." He said, "They do." She brought him the lamb. Over the next several weeks, the conversation between them deepened and complicated itself in the way that conversations between people who are drawn to each other and simultaneously aware of every reason they should not be tend to do It moved in increments. It was cautious and deliberate on both sides, and occasionally, unexpectedly, was neither moments where something genuine and unguarded surfaced through the carefulness, like light through a crack in something that was built to be solid. He told her things he hadn't told anyone in years. Not operational things. He was not reckless, and she had made it quietly but explicitly clear that she was not interested in information that would put either of them in a legally or morally untenable position. But the other things, the weight of it, the way his world worked and what it cost, and what he had understood about those costs too late and too fully to unknow. She told him things, too, about her father, who had worked in the mines and come home tired in a way that wasn't just physical, about the specific character of ambition in a place that doesn't have a lot of room for it, about why she had studied crime not to prosecute it, not to romanticize it, but because she had grown up in a place where the informal economy and the formal one overlapped in ways that the people writing the textbooks never fully accounted for, and she had wanted to understand the overlap honestly. He listened to her the way she had once described listening to him, not performing it, actually doing it. 3 weeks into December, on a Tuesday evening that was cold enough to make the city feel like it had been sealed in glass, something changed again. Raymond Tesaro had not, as everyone had hoped and no one had assumed, simply accepted the failure of October's operation as a concluded matter. He was not that kind of man. His lawyers were managing the federal exposure with the expensive efficiency for which they were paid, and he was managing the other problem, the problem of a Tuesday night in October that had not gone the way it was supposed to in his own way. What his own way turned out to be was not another frontal operation. Tesaro had learned something from October. What he had learned, specifically, was the name Karina Maddox. She found out on a Wednesday morning when a man she had never seen before, young, watchful, in a winter jacket that was slightly too large, was standing on the sidewalk outside her apartment building on North Paulina. He wasn't doing anything specifically alarming. He was just there, and he was there again the following morning. She called Thomas Weller. Weller, to his credit, responded quickly. The federal wheels that had been reviewing her practicum status turned faster suddenly, because a federal research associate being surveilled by a subject organization was a different category of problem than an unauthorized field improvisation. Within 48 hours she had been assigned a contact within the Chicago field office, a composed woman named Agent Sandra Reeves, whose job was to ensure Karina's safety and, simultaneously and not entirely separately, to manage the significant intelligence value of what Karina now represented, a person with deep knowledge of two overlapping criminal organizations who had demonstrated, under pressure, an unusual capacity for operational thinking. She told Dalen about the surveillance on a Thursday evening, in a departure from the usual Tuesday schedule that itself communicated something. He had come to the restaurant for a reason other than routine, and so had she. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You should leave Chicago." She looked at him. "I'm not going to leave Chicago." "Karina." "Dalen." She said his name, his actual name, for the first time. It changed the temperature in the room by some small but measurable amount. "I grew up in a place where people left when things got hard. Most of them didn't come back, and the ones who stayed spent a lot of time wishing they'd gone. I swore I'd never make that calculation." She paused. "I'm not running from Raymond Tesaro. This isn't about bravery," he said. "I know it isn't. It's about consequence and risk and probability. I've done the math. And I'm not leaving, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I need to tell you something. About October. She waited. The leak, he said. Someone told Tesaro I would be here that Tuesday. Someone who knew my schedule. It wasn't an external intelligence failure. He looked at her directly. It was someone inside my organization. She had suspected this since October. The staging time, the specificity of the operation, the fact that it had targeted a private weekly routine rather than a business location or a known meeting, all of it pointed to internal knowledge. Do you know who? She said. I believe so, he said. I haven't moved on it yet. I wanted to be certain. Who? He told her. It was a name she recognized from her research. A man named Derek Calloway, not Derek Ashford, the food critic. A different man entirely who had been Dalen's logistics director for 8 years and who appeared in Karina's academic network maps as a high centrality node in the Morris organization's operational structure. She had written about him in 2 papers as a model of structural reliability. The irony of this was not lost on either of them. He has a brother, Dalen said. The brother owes a significant debt to the Tesaro organization, not a money debt. A leverage debt, Karina said. Yes. She thought about this. You have to move carefully, she said. If you move on him wrong, Tesaro's lawyers will turn it into evidence of... I know, he said. I might be able to help, she said. He looked at her. Not in a way that compromises either of us legally, she said quickly. But there may be a way to document the communication channel between Calloway and Tesaro's operation through the financial research I'm already doing. If the connection is there, it creates a clean evidentiary path that doesn't require, she paused, choosing her words, informal resolution. You're offering to build the case, he said. I'm offering to make sure that when this is resolved, it's resolved in a way that doesn't create additional exposure for anyone in this restaurant. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. The question was simpler and more honest than it sounded, and they both knew it. Karina looked at the candle in its wine bottle. The same table, the same booth, the same specific light, the whole architecture of a place that had become, over the months of Tuesday evenings and single sentences and the accumulated weight of paying attention, something neither of them had expected it to become. Because, she said, I think some things are worth the complication. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, not an almost smile, not the shadow of one, but the genuine, unguarded thing, Dalen Morris smiled. It changed his face entirely. The lamb, he said, after a moment, is better than the ossobuco. I've been telling you that for months. You were right, he said. You're right about most things. I'm right about this too, she said quietly. He held her gaze across the table, across the candle, across the geography of everything that separated their worlds and everything stubborn, improbable, real that had been building between them in the margins of all of it. Yes, he said, I believe you are. The Derek Calloway matter was resolved in February, not through informal resolution, through a meticulous, 7-week financial documentation effort that Karina built in conjunction with agent Sandra Reeves, tracing a series of shell company transfers that connected Calloway's personal accounts to a Tesoro-adjacent real estate holding company in Cicero. The federal indictment that resulted from that documentation included Derek Calloway on 4 counts of racketeering and 1 count of conspiracy. Tesaro's operation, already strained by the October fallout and the financial exposure from the Bridgeport wiretap, did not survive the Callaway indictment intact. Raymond Tesaro himself was not charged. He was never charged, which was consistent with his entire career, but 3 of his key lieutenants were. And the structural damage to his organization's North Side ambitions proved in the assessment of Agent Reeves and the Organized Crime Unit. Effectively decisive. Raymond Tesaro retreated to his Bridgeport restaurant and, according to federal surveillance, began eating dinner there every Tuesday night. No one found the symmetry of this amusing, except, reportedly, Thomas Weller, who mentioned it to a colleague, who mentioned it to a DePaul criminology professor, who mentioned it without names to a graduate student who understood completely. Benedetto's was still open. The red-checkered tablecloths were still there. Frank DeLuca still mixed his Negroni at the bar, and Roberto still communicated in gestures and disappointment, and the ossobuco was still the finest in the continental United States. A new food critic from the Tribune, Derek Ashford, had retired, and his replacement was a younger woman named Sarah Bloom, who wrote with a precision that Ashford had publicly praised on his way out the door, came in on a Wednesday in March, and sat at table 4, and ordered the veal, and then the lamb, and then, in a departure from protocol she didn't bother explaining, ordered them both again. Her review ran the following Sunday, 4.5 stars. She described the restaurant as the kind of place that feels, improbably, like it has survived something, like it has been tested by something larger than the ordinary pressures of the industry, and come through intact. The food earns every star on its own merits. But there is something else here, too, some quality in the room itself, in the way the staff moves and the way the light falls in the evening, and the way the whole establishment holds itself, that suggests a history deeper than its menu. She concluded, I cannot fully explain it. I can only tell you to go. On the last Tuesday of March, Dalen Morris came in at 8:15. He took the corner booth. He ordered the Barolo and the ossobuco and, after a pause, the lamb as well. Karina brought the wine. She set the glass down, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the restaurant moved around them, with its usual Tuesday evening rhythm, the soft percussion of the kitchen, the low warmth of other people's conversations, the guttered light of old wine bottles, doing what wine bottles were apparently always meant to do. There's something I want to ask you, he said. I know, she said. You always know. He said, usually. She said, ask anyway. He asked. She said yes. Outside, on West Huron and North Halstead, on both streets and neither one, in the ambiguous geography that Sal Benedetto had never resolved and never intended, to Chicago was doing what it always did in late March, deciding, without consulting anyone, whether it was still winter or already something else. Inside Benedetto's, the candle in its Chianti bottle burned down to its last half-inch and held there, steady and small and persistent in the dark. That is the story of the night a waitress outmaneuvered 31 armed men, a federal surveillance operation, and the most cold-blooded crime boss in Chicago with nothing but a stolen radio, 4 years of criminology education, and the specific kind of courage that has nothing to prove to anybody. Karina Maddox walked into that restaurant as someone most people looked straight through. She walked out of it having permanently changed the balance of power in a city that thought it had already seen everything. The real lesson here isn't about organized crime or federal warrants, or even the romance that built itself in the margins of all that chaos. It's about what happens when someone deeply underestimates a person who has spent years quietly learning exactly how their world works. Don't be Raymond Tesaro. Don't mistake stillness for weakness, or service for smallness, or a woman pouring wine for someone who doesn't know exactly what you're planning. If this story hit you like this video right now, if you know someone who needs to hear that quiet, people carry enormous power, share it with them tonight. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, complicated, and absolutely worth your time, subscribe and ring that bell, because we are just getting started.